Take a look.
He asked me if I would cooperate in a portrait, and I said I'd be glad to. And then he explained that he was going to do a series of these portraits in preparation for a show exhibiting faces of the North Fork. In the process of talking with him, it came out that he was interested in suggestions of other people that would have an interesting face and also an interesting story.
Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. But no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
But it was right next to the railroad line from where we all arrived, to the camp.
So the Heart Mountain Relocation Center opened its gates on, I believe, August 19th of 1942. It was one of 10 camps that were set up by the War Relocation Authority starting sort of in the early summer of 1942 and opened in August and September to house the roughly 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast that had been forced from their homes in the spring and moved into temporary so-called assembly centers during the summer.
The camp was a farmland.
Heart Mountain was a camp of about, at the maximum population at any one time, around 10,700. That was the largest population that was there at any one time. And interestingly, that made it Wyoming's third largest city during that time period. So Heart Mountain looked, from the outside, it looked a lot like something between a military outpost and a prison camp. It was surrounded by barbed wire. There were a number of guard towers that were positioned at various points around that periphery. And then the camp itself consisted of a number of different areas. The main area was the residential area, where all of these many, many thousands of people lived in barracks that were 120 feet long by 20 feet across. Each barrack was divided up into 6 so-called apartments of varying sizes, depending on how many people were in a family. If you were a very little family or you were single, you would be in a small room of 16 by 20 or even smaller, and then the larger families would have been in a 20 by 20 or even a 24 by 20 room. Single room, bare walls, tar paper barracks, tar paper covering the outside. You would have walked in and seen a light bulb dangling from the ceiling. There would have been a potbelly stove. There would have been a few army cots with thin mattresses, and there would have been a bucket and a broom. And that was what you got when you arrived in August or September of 1942.
My parents had a trip arranged to see Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty. They asked me if I wanted to come along, and I said, sure, why not? It was a beautiful summer day in June. Unbeknownst to me, there was an exhibit at the Ellis Island Museum. The exhibit was called American Concentration Camps, the Japanese American Experience. the interior of the structure was totally exposed and gutted. There was no interior left in it. But it gave the viewer a sense how skimpy these structures were. I had no idea that there was an exhibit about exactly what I've been working with Neil. I had no idea that there was an exhibit of this kind, and I didn't know what was going to be at the museum.
The barracks were grouped into something called blocks. So a block was a group of barracks that functioned as a kind of unit in the camp. Each block had its own mess hall and its own sort of, you might say, recreation building, and also its own latrine and laundry area. And so each block was a kind of little self-governing unit. Each block eventually, after a self-government system was created, had something called a block manager, who was somebody that was elected by the people, the residents of that block, to represent them in the community council that was brought together to represent all of the blocks and take care of some of the components of governing this community. This is a really small city of more than 10,000 people.
I was a block manager of my block then, a young block manager, wet behind the years. But I had many friends, young and old.
So the block managers at Hard Mountain were, more or less like your neighborhood representative to the city council. They would be the voice for the block that the residential block that they represented, on any of the matters that would have come before the self-governing council at the camp.
I was a block manager because the block councilor needed help, young help.
You have to remember that the camp was run by the War Relocation Authority. It was run by the federal government, and it was policed by the military. The periphery, the outer periphery, was policed by the military. So I don't mean to suggest that the community council at Hard Mountain and the block managers would have had all sorts of freedom to run the camp however they wished. But the War Relocation Authority did give a fair amount of authority to the block managers and the council to take care of many day-to-day operations. So, if your block had concerns about the food in the mess hall, if your block had concerns about the plumbing in the laundry facilities, if your block had concerns about, maintenance of the facilities, anything like that might have come up before the community council. And so it would have been the block manager's job basically to be, kind of like the neighborhood representative, taking the temperature of his little local community there, and then serving as a liaison between his block and the council and the administration of the camp.
Besides that, I had another job. I was working on a farm. We all had pay. We got paid in 3 categories. The professionals got 19, the semi got 16, and then the laborers got 12. And we bought most of our winter wear from either Sis Roebuck or Montgomery Ward. I don't know why they got permission to solicit with prisoners of war.
That's basically what it was. There were schools. At first, the schools were basically just empty barrack rooms with no equipment, no blackboards, no books. And then in time, a relatively modern high school building was constructed, nicer elementary school buildings were constructed. And so there was schooling at Heart Mountain. There was a hospital complex staffed by both internee and Caucasian physicians, and then mostly, also a mixed Japanese American and Caucasian nursing staff. There was a large administrative area where all of the white administrators worked. There was a military police area.
At Heart Mountain, I did all odd jobs. Besides being a block manager of the block, I was art editor of the Heart Mountain Sentinel, which is the camp newspaper.
I met Neil Fujita in camp in Heart Mountain, Wyoming, and ever since I came out directly to New York from Heart Mountain, and I've been wondering, what the people we worked with in camp, are doing now. And I've often thought of Neil because he was, as I recall, a very talented artist. And the thing is that every now and then I go to the Japanese American church in Manhattan, and they have a minister by the name of Neil Fujita, who he's not their minister, but he's a guest minister who comes to give sermons at the church now and then. And I've often wondered if it was the Neil Fujita. And I've asked people if Reverend Fujita, is he an artist? And everyone says, well, I don't think so. And anyway, he didn't sound like, it was a Neil I knew.
Oh God, I was young and naive, so many things. But it was so wonderful. Everyone who worked on that paper.
And then today, just quite by accident, it was my turn to be a volunteer docent at the Ellis Island exhibit here on America's concentration camp, our experience during the World War II. And this, young, handsome young man came up and spoke to me, and somehow I can't remember how the name came up. He said he knew Neil Fujita, and I said, is he an artist? And he said yes, and I thought, well, maybe this time I've got the right Neil.
Meeting Kay Masuda was an absolute delight.
It's history. So, that's my story, and I hope Neil comes out to see the show. I hope everyone comes out to see the show. That's the aim of the whole exhibit.
Starting in early 1943, the government began doing a process called registration, which is where they passed out questionnaires to all of the internees who were older than 18 and required them to fill out basic information about themselves, about where they were from, about their reading habits, their finances, their affiliations if they were members of clubs, their familiarity with Japanese culture, participation in quote-unquote American activities, like the PTA or what have you back at home in California.
There were 2 questionnaires we answered.
Whether you were a registered voter, it last asked for some names of references. It asked whether you could speak Japanese or in English and so on. Basically, just trying to get a sense of how stereotypically and culturally American or Japanese you seemed to be. And then they asked 2 key questions, questions 27 and 28.
But a year later, when they came out with a questionnaire from the army saying, are you willing to bear arms and fight for your country?
27 asked whether a person would be willing to go off and serve in the armed forces. And question 28 asked whether people would be willing to forswear loyalty to the Emperor of Japan. These registration forms were used by the government, various agencies of the government, to figure out who was a loyal person and who was a disloyal person.
And I had a roommate who was a Japanese student, graduate from one of the important universities in Tokyo, Meiji University, I believe. He studied economics. His name was Hata. Wonderful man, wonderful guy.
And this whole process of interrogating people about their loyalty caused a great deal of stress and confusion and anger in the camp. So the road got a little bumpy there in early 1943 within the camp, with not mass protests, but something very close to that surrounding this registration process.
And my roommate Hata, unbeknownst to me, had signed up to return to Japan, to repatriate or expatriate. And he didn't know that I had volunteered to join the American Army.
And those loyalty investigations were very poorly handled. They were very insultingly worded, and they really brought to a head all of the resentments that had been building up in Japanese Americans for a year at that point, since they'd been forced from their homes, and then they'd been forced into assembly centers like the Pomona Assembly Center, and then they had been forced into these barren locations in the interior, and then they're poked and prodded about their loyalty. So at that point in 1943, there were quite a number of Japanese Americans who decided that even though they themselves felt like they were American citizens, they felt like the government had basically given up on them and was treating them with suspicion as if they were aliens. And so out of frustration, out of anger, there were not insignificant numbers of Japanese Americans who renounced their citizenship and filed requests to be expatriated, which means basically removed from the United States to Japan. Often you hear people who wish to somehow justify this whole program. They'll point to these expatriations and say, see, these people were disloyal because you gave them the opportunity, and they renounced their citizenship and they announced they wanted to go to Japan. But if you look at these decisions in context, you'll see that these were expressions of frustration and anger and rage at the ways in which the government had trampled on the basic rights of Japanese Americans as citizens. So if you learn that a person was an expatriate or filed a petition for expatriation, in all likelihood, this is a person who had handled or reacted to the government's mistreatments by deciding that they had had enough, and that they felt like they were no longer being treated as a citizen, so maybe their best fortunes lay elsewhere, lay back in Japan. Many of the people who filed petitions for expatriation or who renounced their citizenship had never spent a day in Japan in their entire lives. They were American citizens, they'd been born in the United States, they didn't know from Japan. Their parents were from Japan, but they had not, many of them had never been. That just shows you how deep the frustrations must have run, that somebody who had maybe never even been to Japan, didn't maybe even speak Japanese, threw up their hands and said, I've had enough, and I'm going to renounce my citizenship.
But we were roommates, and we had a lot of fun together. We played mahjong, we played,
in the summer of 1943, the government figured out who was loyal and disloyal, and then converted one of the camps, the Tule Lake camp in California, into what they called a segregation center. This is where they decided they were going to send all of the people who had failed their loyalty questionnaires. So in September of 1943, a couple thousand people from Heart Mountain were put on trains and shipped off to Tule Lake, and some people from Tule Lake who had passed their loyalty tests were taken out of Tule Lake and sent to the other camps, including Heart Mountain. So there was this kind of exchange or shuffling of prisoners.
But when I volunteered for the Army, my roommate had expatriated, and we were living together, but we were very good friends. In fact, I saw him after the war ended, and we met in L.A.
1944, the government reopened the military draft for Japanese Americans, which they had closed down after Pearl Harbor. So the government decides that it wants to start drafting people into the service. That creates a whole new set of controversies at Heart Mountain. So there's a big draft resistance movement that springs up with young men saying, we're not going to serve in the military until you restore our rights as citizens and let us go back to our homes. Over 80 people end up resisting the draft, and those people are all prosecuted in Wyoming courts and sent off to jail for terms of more than 3 years. At that time, the government also began its program of what it called relocation, which is where it was encouraging loyal people who had been found to be loyal to leave camp, either to join the military or to go off and find a job somewhere in the interior of the United States. Not along the West Coast, because they were not allowed to go back to the West Coast at that point. But if you could find a job in St. Louis and you were found to be loyal, they would let you leave for that job. So that happened starting in kind of mid-43 into late 43.
When I moved out of camp, after I volunteered, I could go anywhere and wait for my induction. It took them about 4 months, 3-4 months to check on your background. I went to Cody, which is a town 13 miles away, and it was a hostile town to the Japanese.
The adjacent towns of Cody and Powell had a very kind of two-faced reaction to the internees. Naturally, they shared all of the suspicions of Japanese Americans that the rest of the country had, all of the fears.
From what I learned, right or wrong, many of the initial Marines who encountered the enemy in Wake Island, the first battleground in the Pacific, came from Cody, Wyoming.
And they definitely would put signs in their windows in the shops saying no Japs allowed. So they were in many respects not receptive to the Japanese Americans from the camps.
Barber shops had no Japs on signs outside. I couldn't get a haircut. And to be 19 or close to 20 and to be facing this sort of animosity, it's hard to understand, but it was reality. Prejudice was reality then.
Once the people in the surrounding communities, the farmers especially in Powell and Cody and there in Park County, Wyoming, realized that they had this huge pool of potential labor in the camps, they began to encourage Japanese American internees to leave the camps to do principally agricultural work. And in fact, the sugar beet harvest in that part of the state, all the way up into southern Montana, probably would have rotted in the fields in the fall of 1942 if it had not been for the labor of Japanese American internees from the Heart Mountain Relocation Center. So people would leave camp for periods of days or weeks, and then they would return after the agricultural work was finished.
We didn't hear too much about, read too much about injustice occurring to other nationalities. I learned about the Jews in Italy when I was with the army. They showed us films of what happened in Buchenwald and Auschwitz. What we went through was nothing compared to that. But it was something because it hit hard, very hard, especially if you're a citizen of your country. And I guess the Jews were also citizens of Germany, you know. I moved to Cody to wait for my induction, and I worked at the Green Gables Inn.
So they were in many respects not receptive to the Japanese Americans from the camps.
But when I was in Cody, I was living with the family who was the father and mother of the innkeeper. So I came in as a handyman. I did everything. When the cook was sick, I did some cooking. I was loaned out to their friends to dig ditches. I was loaned out to her father and mother to till the soil in their farm. But I couldn't get a haircut. Her father came to pick me up at the barber shop. The barber says, "Come on into the back door, I'll give you a haircut."
by the same token, they welcomed them for the labor that they could contribute. So Japanese Americans did leave camp to work as domestics in some of the wealthier homes in Powell and Cody. Japanese Americans, as I say, worked in agriculture.
The mother was a gentle woman, wonderful woman. The father, her husband, who came to the barber shop to get me out of there. He says, "Who told you you could come here and get your hair cut?" So I was there for a few months, and I got terribly ill when I lived with them in a basement. But his wife was very kind. She came down in the basement to look after me. She came down in the basement to my room to bring me some soup, and she saw I had on the wall some prints of Picasso and Bonnard and Vuillard, painters whose work I liked. She came down, and I was carrying 3 or 4 books with me at that time, and one was Candide by Voltaire. She came down and she saw the prints, looking at them, wondering what they were, who they were, but I think she knew. And I was reading Baudelaire.
At 19 years old.
Yeah, I was really curious. But Candide was one of my first. When I read Candide, I said to myself, my God, another young man looking for some place under the sun, looking for a possible world for himself. And so when she saw these books I was reading, and she asked me about Candide, I says, oh, I enjoyed it. She said, how about Baudelaire? I says, oh, yes. I said, would you like to take one of these? And so we met, actually, for the first time in the basement of her home, and we exchanged things that we read.
And at various points, Japanese Americans were allowed to come into town to do business, to do some shopping. The camp newspaper, the Heart Mountain Sentinel, actually printed out of the offices of the Cody Enterprise in Cody, Wyoming. So there were instances of cooperation between folks from the town and from the camp. I don't mean to suggest that it was all hostility. The scouting troops often did jamborees together. The churches were supportive of the internees from the surrounding towns. So it was sort of a mix of some fear and some hostility and some kind of cautious embrace, I guess you would say, in certain instances.
And then I had to leave, to go to the army. But wherever you are, Arthur, somebody comes along and touches you. Wherever you are, South Hole, Greenport, anywhere, Flanders.
Late 1944, the government finally revokes the mass exclusion from the West Coast, right around the same time that the Supreme Court is announcing that the government doesn't have the authority to continue to hold loyal people in the camps. And so starting at the very end of 44 and then very much into January and February of 1945, people begin to leave the camps in greater numbers and head back to try to piece their lives together back on the West Coast. But there were quite a number of people who, even though they were allowed to leave the camp at that point, their lives had pretty much been ruined. They had been forced from their homes, they'd lost any savings that they had nothing, they had no ability to find work, and they were still the objects of great resentment and suspicion along the West Coast. So a not insignificant number of people at Heart Mountain and the other camps more or less refused to leave the camps because they had nowhere to go and they had no idea how they were going to piece their lives back together again. So slowly people, in a way, almost had to be forced out, and so finally the camp administration just began closing down more and more of the mess halls, more and more of the barrack areas, more and more of the services that were offered. Finally, in November of 1945, the very last internees were put onto a train and given $25 and a train ticket and shipped back to the West Coast and more or less left to, put their lives back together. So that was the life of the camp from 42 into end of 1945.
We took the northern route back, drove back, and we drove back to Cody. And we visited the campsite because there's no building anymore, and all it was the memorial which people built with the plaques explaining what the camp was about. In fact, I went to the library in Cody to find out if there were any literature about the camp, whether Cody had a library.
About Hart Mountain?
Yes, which is 13 miles away, which is history. And there was a beautiful young girl in the information counter, in the booth. And I asked her if she had anything that I can look at. And she says, no, we don't, she said. She was a teenager, I think. Charming. She says, were you in that camp? She pointed towards. I said, yes, I was. And she says, cool, Arthur. I said, yes, it was cool. And suddenly, my recollection of the camp and Mrs. And the lady who's so kind, it all sort of dissipated, She should reply with, cool. Sure was cool.